root types, functions, and structures. Let's take a look at what all roots have in common and also how they differ a little bit from each other. Most of you probably already know what a root does for a plant. Generally, we find roots under the ground. There are some exceptions we'll talk about called adventitious roots. You've probably seen aerial roots in your travels or maybe at in particular locations. But in general, we find roots under the ground in the below ground environment, and one of their jobs is to help hold the plant in place so they don't wash away anytime the wind blows or the rain comes down. But the primary function of roots is to assist in taking up water from that surrounding environment, and with it, those nutrients that are dissolved in water that a plant is getting from the surrounding below ground environment, and taking it from that part of the plant and bringing it all the way into every cell that undergoes photosynthesis, because those nutrients are vital for plant growth and function, and that water is essential for the process of photosynthesis, which we'll be talking about soon, in order for that plant to create energy for itself. So the primary functions of the roots remain the same from plant to plant, but the way that those roots are organized into different systems can vary, and we'll talk about three. On the left, you see there the taproot. This is one primary root with smaller secondary roots coming off of it. The fibrous root system, which is a lot of these very thin, kind of evenly spread roots, and then finally adventitious roots. So plants usually have one of these three types of root system. So taproot you're probably familiar with. Again, if you've ever eaten a carrot or a parsnip, this is a very taproots are actually a great source of food because they're usually thicker and full of nutrients and water. But a taproot like this parsnip here, radish, carrot, all examples. One main root that comes directly from the stem, and so those leaves, those stems are attached, and then that root is carrying out those functions for the plants. The actual anatomy, again, if you've ever peeled a carrot or a parsnip, there's kind of that larger primary root with these lateral or secondary kind of side little roots. And then even on these tiny roots here, we'll see those teeny tiny root hairs we talked a little bit about when we were going over the meristem, which we'll look at here in a second. No need to write down kind of these details, but if you've ever opened and cut open a carrot and wondered how there's kind of that lighter section in the middle and that brighter orange on the outside, you're looking at the medulla, the center, and the cortex. So we're actually going to zoom in and look at this at a more microscopic level in a second, so don't worry about getting those labels down. Fibrous roots we find in things, for example, like turf grass, where they're able, because they're more fine and spread out, they're able to really root a plant in place, so an area that a plant would need greater stability. Again, they're carrying out the same functions, but their structure, instead of having one primary root, is going to be a lot more fibrous and hair-like. Again, very common in turf grass. Adventitious roots are kind of a broad category that we give to roots that a plant grows in order to carry out some kind of function, usually to exploit a certain environment. For example, you might have a tropical plant that's climbing, and you might have, it needs to anchor itself to a wall. Or if you've ever taken a cutting, for example, like this little geranium here, adventitious roots might form to help that plant carry out those functions, where normally that would have been stem tissue rather than root tissue. Epiphytes. So an epiphytic plant is a plant that grows on something else, not a parasite, right? It's got roots, so it's able to collect its own nutrients and water. It's just anchored somewhere else, like on a rock or on the branch of a tree. These aerial or epiphytic roots might form. This is very common in plants like orchids, for example, in order to collect nutrients and water from that kind of more of an above ground environment than a below ground environment. So why would plants go to all this trouble to differentiate themselves, right, with all these different types of root systems? Take a look at this cross section here. Imagine this is kind of a cross section of the soil, and notice how even within the same region, if these plants, this carrot and the sunflower and the oat, they're all growing next to each other, how even in this environment they can kind of exploit different regions, different zones kind of within here. If you think about it, all plants are competing for the exact same thing. They need sunlight, which they get up above. They need water and nutrients, which they're getting from down below. And so anything they can do to kind of differentiate themselves from interspecial competition that allows them to kind of absorb what nutrients are here without necessarily all going for the same thing. Imagine if this is a whole row of carrots, is one of the reasons that we imagine these different types of root systems developed. Take a look. We talked a little bit briefly earlier about meristems and how apical meristems are found on kind of the tips of the roots and the tips of the shoot. So here I'm looking again at that root tissue. This is a microscope. Down here is that root cap. These cells are very thick. They have very thickened walls. And actually inside each of those cells is a little teeny a sensor of gravity. So this is what actually tells a plant to grow, the root to grow down. And we'll talk about that more when we go over seed germination. But over here is kind of this area of elongation where this apical meristem, this primary growth is happening. These cells are dividing and developing and growing. And within, regardless if it's a tap root like this here or a secondary root in a fibrous system, they're going to have vascular tissue. In vascular plants, so we're talking here about plants that have the ability to transport water and nutrients through the use of vascular tissue, they're going to have the xylem and the phloem. The xylem, which is the vascular tissue responsible for taking water and carrying it throughout the plant, is going to get this water from the root hairs and elsewhere and take it to the rest of the plant, all the way up to the leaves, who need that water in order to undergo photosynthesis. And then that glucose that's made through the process of photosynthesis is going to travel all the way back down to the roots through that phloem in order to supply it with the nutrients it needs to carry out functions like primary growth. So the meristems, here's just a closer picture. I believe this is the root of an onion. The meristems, that area of elongation, are inside those roots at the very tip, and then we also have vascular tissue. Now, how this phloem and xylem are arranged does vary depending on the kind of plant that we're going to be growing. In this case, we're going to be looking at a monocot root. What's a monocot? What's a dicot? Well, take a look. Here's just a cross-section of a root, and we're going to talk a little bit about vascular tissue and then go over kind of the difference of how the way that that's arranged can be different among flowering plants. So if you take a look, right here in the center, X marks the spot, which is helpful because xylem also starts with the X. So right smack dab in the middle of a dicot root, a dicotyledonous root, we'll talk about that in a second, the xylem tissue that conducts water is in the shape of an X. And then the phloem on the outside, this is, I always think phloem, phloem, food, right? This is where your nutrients are being transported, is kind of along the outside of that xylem. And then inside there we have kind of this tissue where growth occurs, where some secondary growth occurs. And of course the epidermis is just a fancy way to say the skin, which is where our root hairs are attached. So let's take a minute to talk about what a monocot and a dicot is. Back last week we talked a lot about plant taxonomy, and we know that all plants, to get into the plant kingdom, have to do one thing, and that is photosynthesize. Well, they also need to be made of plant cells, but they kind of go hand in hand. Within that plant kingdom, the next taxa is phylum or division, right? And so at phylum or division level, we separate between the non-vascular plants, like our bryophyta. The division bryophyta would include mosses, for example, and our vascular plant. And there's several divisions of vascular plants. There's the magnolia phyta, right, which is some of our plants with seeds. There's conifera phyta, which is sort of our seedless plants that are plants with seeds that are over here. And then there's also our seedless plants. So our seedless plants at that level, at the division level, separate out. So our pteridophyta, our ferns, for example. Now all of those are vascular plants versus non-vascular plants, but they separate out at that division level. Further down, within plants that are vascular plants, there are plants that produce seeds that are covered seeds and plants that produce seeds that are naked seeds. And we'll talk more about that. But in general, know that your gymnosperms are things like your pine trees that have cones, and your angiosperms would basically be all of your flowering plants. And that includes everything from like the flower that produces an apple, right, to grasses like corn and wheat. And it's at that next level, right? So we've done kingdom, we've done phylum or division, and now we're at the class level. So we're talking about a class of plants, and you're either a monocot or a dicot. So if you looked at a plant's taxonomy, and some of you might have done either a monocot here, a monocot, or a dicot when you did your taxonomy table last week, this level, this class level, is where they differ. And how their tissue is actually arranged, both in the root as in the shoot, and even some parts like the flower, look a little different. So on my left here is a corn plant, and corn is in the class Liliopsida, which makes it a monocot. We call it a monocot for one reason, and that's this coleoptile. It's an abbreviation for monocotyledonous, expialidocious, right? That's a hard one. And what it means is when the seed germinates, one little coleoptile, or cotyledons, plural, right? There's two in a dicot, one in a monocot. So that prefix mono means one little kind of what we'll call a baby leaf or primordial leaf. A cotyledon emerges, and in the dicot there are two. So here's my monocot, my corn plant, with one that emerges from the seed, and here's my dicot over here with two. But keep in mind, before anything happens up above ground, when a seed is germinating, the very first thing that comes out is the primary root, or the radicle. It's like a kind of a baby root. So anyway, the difference between a monocot, which we have on our left, our corn plant, and the dicot over here, the differences go all the way down to the root. If we were to slice open the root of a dicot, we would see that X marks the spot in the center, and our vascular tissue, our phloem, here is kind of outside that X, and here's just kind of a cross section of that. Whereas in our monocots, we're going to see more of a ring. So here's kind of a little drop. You've got a little X marks the spot in a dicot, but in a monocot, this tissue, this vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, are kind of arranged in this ring. There's a few other differences between monocots and dicots, right? We'll talk about them a little bit as we go, but in general, the root tissue, the vascular tissue in a monocot is in a ring, and in a dicot, X marks the spot. We'll be talking a bit more about monocots and dicots throughout the next couple of weeks. But in general, keep in mind that how their root tissue is arranged does vary between a monocot and a dicot, but the primary functions do not. In both of these plants, including plants that are non-vascular. If you go up, back up to the division level, the primary role of the root is to absorb the water and the nutrients that are dissolved into that water that a plant needs in order to carry out vital processes.